Hi guys, today I am going to do a review of the Inferno Dante's Guide to Hell TTRPG by Acheron Games. This is going to be an honest review. I am going to give the pros and the cons of the campaign so you kind of know what you're getting into. Let me preface this by saying that I am a new GM. This is the first module I have ever run. Ran the whole thing. It took us about a year to get through, I would say. So there are two books that make up this particular campaign. The first is the red one, which is Dante's Guide to Hell. It contains the information for the character's race, the classes, the mechanics, things like that. Also, about halfway through, it has descriptions of the different levels of hell. Personally, I recommend not giving this part to your players. There's even a note at the beginning of this section that suggests that in the book because it gives a lot away. And as you'll see in the GM guide, some of the later levels really don't provide much in that GM guide. So you're going to kind of want to refer back to this description here to kind of get an idea of at least some things that you may be able to put into those levels. So it's probably a better idea to not let your players read it. You could have them watch a video that describes the levels or just have them kind of Google it, read up on Wikipedia, just to give them a basic idea of what's happening. You also should probably just kind of briefly go over the levels and the sins that are tied to them in session 0. I do have a video that I had my players watch. It's pretty funny and short. I'll link it in the description, and it's a good description of the various levels of hell. The second book is the blue one, which is Virgilio's Untold Tales. It is the GM guide. It contains the introductory campaign, the adventure hooks, monsters, keepers, which are kind of like the bosses of the levels, and magic items, things like that. So, I want to start with just my general thoughts. It is a really cool concept for a campaign. I have always liked Dante's Inferno and the Divine Comedy in general, so it really drew me in. Also, the artwork, as you can see here in some of these pictures, the artwork is absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's just stunning, and it really creates a nice visual of what they kind of want you to see for this campaign. Just absolutely beautiful. I'd love to hang a lot of these art pictures on my wall. Just gorgeous. But on the whole, it felt like it was more of a setting book than an actual campaign. Yes, they say there is an introductory campaign, but it is very much an introductory campaign. It stops pretty early, doesn't give you a lot, but I'll discuss that more in detail later. So it has like a good starting baseline, but it just wasn't a box ready campaign. So know that going into this, you are going to have to do a lot of homebrewing to make this into a fully fleshed out campaign. I think I did about 4 months worth of research and prep before we started playing because there's just not a lot given, and I had to fill it in with something, and I wanted to stay true to the original Dante's Inferno, which kind of limits you. And I'll go into that more later as well. Many of these suggested hooks and stuff that they do provide after a while are combat related, which can kind of make it feel a bit like a dungeon crawl at times. So it's something to kind of keep in mind, but it is difficult to add additional roleplay opportunities outside of the Infernal Chronicles if you want to stay true to Dante's Inferno, like, a barkeeper or a shop owner. They're not really going to fit into Dante's Inferno because those things just don't go with the world, and I'll discuss that more in the later section. Another thing is the book really needs to be proofread severely. Let me preface this by saying that I am an editor by trade. That is my day job. So this stuff really sticks out to me, but there were a lot of errors. And yeah, it really needs to be proofread. So don't go in expecting it to be perfectly edited and clean because it isn't. I would not really recommend this for a new DM. as a new DM, it was extremely challenging and extensive amount of work because of all the homebrewing I had to do, and I just felt lost a lot of the time. So if you do decide to do it as a new DM, it's definitely a trial by fire sort of campaign because you're going to be put through the ringer, and on the other side, you will definitely feel pretty confident about running any module out there. I also would recommend this for a brand new D&D group. It would fit better with an established group that's familiar with each other and stuff because there are a lot of religion and history, time period things that can create some pretty heated discussions. So that's definitely something you kind of want to warn your players about in session 0, and it just would fit better with an established group than a group who's never played together before, and you could end up having some conflict. Also, I would check to see if your players have any triggers, and there are some references and quote unquote sins that you are probably going to want to remove or reduce or change or something. Just keep in mind that Dante's Inferno was written in the early 1300s, and it very much has that mentality, so which doesn't really fit well with today. I also recommend examining the rules and things like that for any inconsistencies in session 0 because the book does tend to contradict itself. Okay, so now I think I want to talk about the setting some. As I said, the setting is good. I mean, it's a really cool idea, all these various levels of hell, which are all pretty different. But it's difficult for a D&D campaign if you want to be true to Dante's Inferno because adding a shop or a tavern or something like that, it just doesn't really fit. And you wouldn't really need like a shop or a place to get food anyway because it's stated that your characters do not need to eat or drink, and there is very minimal loot in this campaign. The only real loot are magic items because when a enemy is killed, they basically just turn to ash, and everything they had on them that wasn't a magic item is destroyed, and then the enemies will later respawn because nothing actually dies in hell. So there would really be no reason to have shops because there just isn't going to be much loot that they would sell in the first place. It's just magic items. Oh, and something about the magic items is that the characters are only allowed to have one magic item attuned to them essentially at a time. So if they want to attune to something later, they'll have to drop what they have and stuff like that. There are a couple of items because of how they work and stuff that I allowed them to have as like an additional freebie magic item that is attuned to them, but it's kind of up to you how you want to handle that. As I said, there was a most of the hooks that they provide are combat related, which kind of can cause a bit of a dungeon crawl feel at times. So you're definitely going to want to try to add in as much as you can that isn't combat to just kind of flesh it out more. Some areas, like the Malabouche, for example, as you can see here, that's all they provide. Just that little bit right there. That's the entire Malabouche section in the Dungeon Master Guide. So yeah, as you can see, it's not much, and the Malabouche has 10 sub levels. So, and they're all pretty detailed, and a lot of them will even be sin levels that are tied to characters, which I'll talk about later. What you're going to end up having to do is probably go back to the Dante's Guide to Hell book and at least look at the section that kind of describes the levels just to kind of get some ideas of what it may look like so you can come up with some ideas to actually put in there. I ended up adding a lot of athletics and acrobatics checks for them having to climb in and out of them, added some enemies, added some traps, some puzzles, some various encounters and things just to try to make them as interesting as I could. But it's definitely a kind of a They just don't provide a lot for this particular level, and there's a lot of other levels that are similar. With the campaign, it does have, as I say, an introductory campaign. By that, it basically stops after Lust. After Lust, which is one of the first major levels of Hell that you're going down into the negative stuff. It's right after Limbo. And after Lust, they don't offer you any other quests or anything like that. They'll just provide you with a few hooks. Like I said, most are combat related. Some will have more than others. Like Gluttony had a decent amount of stuff provided, but Greed had pretty much nothing. So it's just something that you're gonna have to keep in mind, is that you're gonna have to homebrew just a lot of stuff. Another thing, sort of setting based, sort of NPC based, there is an Orpheus and Eurydice subplot. Orpheus is the one who kind of initially guides the player characters through the first part of Hell. Eventually, you'll get to a point where he is supposed to be quote unquote killed and sent back to Limbo where his punishment is. But I provided my players the chance to bring him back if they wanted to. They had to spend some of their hope points to do it, and we'll talk about hope points later. And they chose to do that, so they brought him back, and then they rescued Eurydice, his wife, in Lust. And we had Orpheus and Eurydice with us for the entire campaign, all the way down to Satan in Treachery. We also had one of the player characters, Infernal Chronicles. She kind of was a special circumstance, and she was with us for the entire campaign as well. So she kind of just trailed along as part of our motley crew, because we had quite a few strays at one point. That's what we were calling them, strays. Various devils and things that were just kind of trailing along with us. Now I think I want to talk about the characters. So I had 6 players. I had the Saint, which is the Paladin. I had the Tyrant, which is the Fighter. I had the Serpent, which is the Rogue. I had the False Prophet, which is the Warlock. I had the Heresiarch, which is the Sorcerer. And I had the Jester, which is the Bard. And as you can see by these pictures, the artwork for these characters just absolutely gorgeous. And the characters just look so cool. Something that I did want to mention is that each character has a particular sin that is kind of tied to their class. And one of the levels of Hell will be tied to that sin. So it's kind of what I just call them their sin level. So, for example, the Paladin's sin is tied to violence against God, which is the 3rd round of violence. So, whenever you're in a character's sin level, that character is basically weakened severely. They have disadvantage on pretty much everything. If they have to use hope points, they have to double the amount that they use. So if they lost 4, they actually lost 8. And pretty much anything, the enemies, the environmental hazards, anything are basically going to target them. So this is kind of one of those times when you are supposed to really go after a particular character, because that's just part of the sin level. So everything should be targeting that character. So it's kind of a cool mechanic because it really gives that particular player a challenge during that level, and it also kind of gives the team a chance to kind of really rally around and kind of protect them and help them out and stuff. So it is a really cool concept that I really liked. So like I said, the Paladin was violence against God, which is the 3rd round of violence. The Fighter was violence against others, which is the 1st round of violence. The Rogue was the 7th Bolgia in the Malbolge, which is the Bolgia of Thieves. The Warlock was the 9th Bolgia in the Malbolge, which is the Sowers of Discord. The Sorcerer was Heresy, and the Bard was the 2nd round in violence, which is violence against oneself. All of those levels were quite a challenge for them, but they enjoyed it. And then when they come out on the other side, they get some extra hope and things like that, inspiration, bonuses for making it through. And it's kind of important for their character to overcome this thin level. When your players are designing their characters, I recommend having them kind of build reasons for why they want to repent into their backstory when they're creating their characters. Because kind of the whole point of the campaign is that the characters will repent and overcome their sins so that they can get out of hell and not come back later on. So you want to make sure they don't make their characters irredeemable. And also, another thing to kind of keep in mind is that no one is supposed to start with a good alignment. Everyone is either going to be neutral or evil of some sort. So it's kind of, they have to work to get to the point where they're good. I also recommend kind of picking a time frame or an era for the characters to come from ahead of time and telling them so that they can kind of work on that for their backstory. What I did was I gave them a year cutoff. I said they couldn't be from any later than the 1700s, and so I ended up with characters from several different time periods, which was ended up actually being really cool. I had a crusader, I had people from the medieval era, I had people from later in the 1700s who were like, familiar with more inventions, like there were pistols and things like that. And it just kind of created an interesting dynamic between the characters. And they should pick an era or something and research it when they are creating their backstory so that they really can kind of add in that flavor because it's really important to the campaign. In character creation, initially, when they're creating their character, they do have a lot of freedom. They can put their +2 and +1 to whatever they want, so it kind of follows the rules in Tasha's Cauldron of everything for that. They also have major and minor blessings they can pick from. They're kind of like racial traits, feats, like you can choose dark vision, or you can choose to be resistant to necrotic damage and things like that. It's just something else that gives them like cool way to customize their racial abilities and things like that instead of having it forced upon them like, okay, you are a halfling, you are brave, you get lucky, things like that. So they have more options that they can do. I will say that some of the character classes are a lot more powerful than others. Some of them are just not balanced very well at all. Melee characters tended to feel more balanced than the magic characters, but there was just usually something in all of them that just didn't really work, that just either made the character too powerful or nerfed them. Let me go through a few examples, few major examples that we had. So let's start with the sorcerer. They have resistance to all types of damage from the very beginning. And it's just throughout the entire campaign, they're resistant to everything. And it kind of ended up becoming frustrating for both me and the character. My sorcerer didn't really feel like it was enough of a challenge because every time he got hit, he hardly took any damage. And then I got to the point where it was like, I just didn't even attack him that much because it was like, well, what's the point? He's resistant to everything. He hardly takes any damage. So the character, the sorcerer himself, decided that he wanted to restrict his resistances to just being resistant to fire and necrotic damage, which actually fits with the class type because of some of the characteristics of the class. So that made it much better for all of us, and we had it got rid of a lot of the frustration. The Bard, they have something called Touch of Madness, and it is basically a way to add additional damage to things. And they get to the point where they can add their Touch of Madness to any spell that they cast. The problem is that when you get up to those higher levels, especially, and they're casting like magic missile and things like that at higher levels, they are adding these Touch of Madness dice in addition to like a magic missile to every one of those bolts. And even though I restricted how many they could use, they were still doing somewhere between 100 and 200 damage every time they would fire off magic missile at their top level. I mean, it was insane. And it was just so overpowered that it just kind of created an imbalance. And that was after I restricted it. So that one in particular, you may want to look at and kind of adapt how it is. Otherwise, you're going to have a very overpowered bard at higher levels. The tyrants, they have this thing called a blood die that they get through attacking and stuff, where it's basically a way a die to add extra damage to a roll. But the book is very contradictory about how long they have them for. At one point, they say they have the die till the end of their turn and they have to use it there. But then they say, no, you have it till the end of a rest. And it contradicts itself pretty severely. So it would probably be best. And I think that's what we did is we decided to say they would just have them until combat was over. So however many rounds combat was, if they hadn't used them up by the end of that, then they would lose them, which isn't that big of a deal because they always are getting more. And the paladin. The paladin had a few things that were causing some issues. They have a banner that is their main melee weapon. And the thing about it is, as long as it's unsullied, so not bloody, it hasn't been used to actually attack anything, it puts everybody under protection of the bless spell. So as long as they haven't used their banner, every single person in the party has the bless spell, which is great. But it kind of made it so that my paladin felt like he couldn't ever attack in melee because, especially at early levels, because that bless spell was so much more useful. And he's just like, I don't really feel like paladin. All I do is like, cast spells and stuff. So it just kind of is a little bit unbalanced. So it may be something you may want to kind of look at. Another thing is that one of the paladins' infernal emblems, and we will talk about those later, is what's called veiled gaze, and it essentially means they are blind. They have a big veil over their eyes, and all they have is blind sight in a 30-foot radius. That created a lot of problems because that's just not very long. So anything in combat or exploration that was outside of 30 feet, they were literally blind and could see nothing. And it just ended up becoming frustrating and a hassle for literally everyone. I recommend extending that blind sight to 60 feet at least. That way they stand a better chance of actually being able to fight without having to have another character like lead them around and stuff, which that really got tiring. There is a magic item that they get. It's fairly early on. It's at the end of Limbo that provides true sight in a 120-foot radius, and they naturally grab that so that they would be able to see better. But they felt like they couldn't ever exchange it for another magic item, like a cool weapon or something that may be of better use to them, because without it, they're restricted to like 30 feet of being able to see. So what I ended up having to do was added 60 feet of blind sight to a magic weapon so that they could switch their magic items. Just some options, but it's a broken feature and it really needs to be changed. Another thing is that I guess just kind of going to depend on your paladin, but they kind of get additional healing spells that paladins don't usually have, like healing word and stuff like that. But my paladin kind of said he felt like he was stuck being the team medic and he had to kind of conserve all his spell slots because he had to keep healing everybody. And he felt like he couldn't use Divine Smite that often because of that. So it's just something that your paladin's probably going to need to be aware of to kind of figure out how they want to handle that. So I recommend kind of going through everyone's abilities during session 0 to see if you need to tweak anything or if anything just doesn't feel balanced, so that, everything's on the same page. Okay, so now I want to talk about the Infernal Emblems a little bit. Each player character has 3 emblems that are essentially tied to their character. They can't get rid of them, they are literally part of the character. So let's take the Paladin, for example. The Paladin has a banner and shield. It's kind of a combined item. That's their melee weapon attack. They have a silver halo, which represents their armor. And then they have the Veiled Gaze, which I already talked about, that makes them blind and stuff like that. Each of these emblems have the ability to kind of increase in power. So at levels, I believe it's level 5, 9, 13, and 17. Yeah, that's right. 5, 9, 13, and 17. So at those levels, they have the opportunity to torment, burn, and damn their items. And that makes them more powerful, and there's different levels. So like the banner, if he chose to torment it, he may get more damage. It does additional damage and additional attack. If he chose to do it to the halo, it would increase his AC, things like that. And every character has ones that are specifically tied to them that they can do this and kind of get more powerful and stuff. At times, my characters thought they felt a little too restrictive. They would have liked a little more variety, but that's just kind of, I think, more of a personal preference thing on their part. But it's definitely up to you if you want to figure out a way to add more variety into them. There also are some negatives that are attached to some of the emblems. For example, the bard has these bells that are, you can see in the picture, are kind of part of their costume, and they're one of their emblems. And one of the things they do is they cause disadvantage with stealth because obviously they're jingling everywhere. With the fighter, because they're this big, scary looking skeletal dude, they give disadvantage on being frightened to everyone, including the player characters. So if something is trying to scare those player characters, they should probably not be anywhere near the tyrant. Another thing is that some of them also cause damage to the player character when they're used. For example, the warlock has a sword. It's like an obsidian sword or something, and whenever they attack with it, they take, I think it's necrotic damage of some amount to kind of compensate for having the weapon. So it's just something to kind of be aware of that your characters are probably going to want to pay attention to. Now I want to talk about the Infernal Chronicles. They are kind of an integral part of your character's backstory. There are damned souls that are tied to your characters that they're supposed to meet in various levels and kind of like have a interaction with of some sort or something like that. But the way they were originally supposed to be done, according to the book, was that they were just essentially random souls that the characters could come across and they could just choose to unlock a bond with them. Like, here is Bobatus the Unwise. And then a character would be like, I know Bobatus. And then another character could be like, I know Bobatus too. And all your characters could decide they know Bobatus because they're trying to get their Infernal Chronicles out of the way. Even though it may make no sense how they all know them, there's a good chance they would probably try to just get their Infernal Chronicles done really quickly. And you're supposed to have basically like 3 to 5 of them, I believe. So you could have them done with their Infernal Chronicles by the time you leave Limbo, which would not be a good thing. So what I did was I changed it quite a lot, and my players actually really liked what I did. So I made it so that before we started playing, that they every one of them had to provide me with 5 named souls, which sin level those souls would be in. So if they were in lust or greed or heresy or whatever, uh, how they knew the souls and why they think those souls were in hell in that particular sin level. And then that kind of gave me the opportunity to tailor encounters and quests and conversations to like each soul individually ahead of time. And then I was able to kind of design the things specifically for my players, which gave me more time to prepare, and it made it a lot more personal for them. And they liked it better because they felt more connected to it. And it was a great way to kind of incorporate backstory and stuff like that. I do also recommend that you're probably going to want to cut off how deep they can have these Infernal Chronicles. I cut it off after the first level of treachery. There are 4 levels in treachery. I said the first level was the last level they could use because the deeper you go in treachery, well, it's just a bunch of frozen heads in a lake. And eventually they're completely frozen to where no one could even talk to them. So I'm like, there's only so much you can do with frozen heads. So I'm like, that's was my cutoff is the first level of treachery. So just something to think about. Now let's talk about the enemies a little bit. There are some interesting enemies. There's angels, there's furies, there's centaurs, Medusa, all sorts of things like that. But a lot of the most common enemies that they will encounter are just devils. And there are minor devils, guardian devils, and major devils. And they feel kind of generic. They don't really change. They do the same attacks, things like that, which can make them feel a little redundant. So you may want to kind of, give them abilities or spells or something like that that is more focused around what circle they're in. So, for example, in Lust, there's a lot of storms and hurricane winds and things like that. So maybe they do extra lightning damage, or they have shocking grasp or something like that that they can do to add a little bit of flavor to the devils. Otherwise, they do feel pretty generic. Another thing to just be aware of is that a lot of the enemies, especially the bosses, but even some of the just regular enemies, had really high wisdom and wisdom saving throws, which kind of made some of the characters who had a lot of wisdom based spells feel like nothing ever worked because these monsters just had these really high saving throws and stuff. So you may want to kind of look at the different enemies and stuff and maybe drop it down a little bit so that the players stand a better chance of actually hitting them. Another thing is to kind of figure out how much you want Lucifer to be involved. What I did, whereas I had it where his body was trapped down in the lowest level of hell where it's supposed to be, but that his spirit could kind of roam free through all the different levels. So he like watched them and knew everything they did and said, and then he later used it against them. He knew what buttons to push essentially. There are also a couple of magic items that will offer the players some additional options when they get to Lucifer, but my players, despite me telling them that these were very important and would be very important when they reach Lucifer, lost both of the ones that could have helped. So just something to be aware of. I also used deals with Lucifer. He offered them like a generic deal where he would just let them all go if they killed all the other like stray souls and things that they brought along with them. And if they had done that, then those souls would have been sent back to the punishment of whatever sin level they were from. And they chose not to do that, which was cool. So and I that's kind of what I expected them to do. So I had Lucifer create very specifically tailored deals that were made for each character and based on their characters' desires and things like that. And two of my six players accepted his deals. One ended up regretting it a lot, but yeah, so it was kind of a cool different option for ways to handle it. But those two characters have definitely not able to repent. They have a one-way ticket back down because of the deal they made. So it was kind of a fun addition that the characters, my players, like doing. Now I want to talk about the hope points a little. Hope points are kind of like the currency of hell for your characters. When your characters are killed, like they fail all their death saves and everything, you will have a magic item that is either a torch or a lantern that has the divine flame in it. And when your character dies, they spend hope points to essentially be reborn. So that's one of the major things that hope points are used for, but they can also use it to trade with devils for favors, or they could use it to kind of use extra powers they have. So it's just like a currency basically. But the thing about them is they're really limited. There's only 33 that they get for the entire campaign, and there's only very few chances for them to kind of replenish any of the ones that they've lost. So you may want to kind of add some more opportunities for them to get hope points back than what the book actually suggests, because there's just not a lot of opportunities. There's also divine inspiration. It can be used as like regular inspiration in D&D, but it also has another aspect where they can use it if they are about to lose hope points. Well, they can use the inspiration to not lose those hope points. So if they're about to lose 3 hope points, they can be like, I want to use my inspiration, and then they keep those 3 hope points, which is good. So you're probably going to want to try to give them inspiration every so often so they at least kind of have a buffer to kind of minimize how many hope points they lose. Another thing, like I said, they can use the hope points to kind of embrace a certain power. It's called embracing your sin. And each character has something. It costs 2 hope points to use. But the thing is that a lot of them are just not that good. And the characters just didn't end up ever using them because they weren't worth it. There are a couple that were good, but most of them were just like, yeah, I wouldn't spend 2 hope points on that. One of the good ones was the sorcerer. It was basically so if they're rolling to do fire damage, they can spend 2 hope points to deal maximum damage instead of rolling. So, if you're doing a fireball at a very high level or something, that could be a lot of extra damage. So that would actually be useful, and my sorcerer did do that a couple of times. A paladin, they basically could spend 2 hope points to immediately purify their banner and reactivate the bless spell, which they never did because it would have been pointless. So they're in the middle of combat. They bring back the bless spell, and then it goes right away again when they use their banner the next time. So it wasn't worth the expense. So I recommend either making some of the opportunities to embrace their sin more powerful or maybe making it cheaper to use, like only using 1 hope point instead of 2, because there are some that if it wasn't 2, they probably would have used it. I also wanted to mention some additions that I added with homebrewing and stuff that you guys may find useful to use yourselves when you are designing your version of the campaign. So I added a rebellion, like revolution. It basically was between Plutus, who was one of the former rulers of Hell, and Hecate, who is the current queen of Hell and is his ex-wife. And I kind of made it where there's a bunch of like named demons and other little characters and stuff that are involved. And I also tied in some of the players' Infernal Chronicles to this rebellion. Like one of my characters had a long lost love who was who used to do like participate in peasant revolutions to try and help overthrow the lords and stuff in her life. So I made her part of this revolution when she's in hell. And it was a cool little thing. And my players really liked the revolution angle. And I also added a couple of extra magic items that I created. I did the Spear of Longinus, which basically adds a lot more radiant damage and stuff, which, radiant damage is pretty hard to resist, especially with devils and demons and things like that. And I also created the Judas coins, like the 30 pieces of silver. So they basically had 30 uses of these coins, and they had various powers, but their main thing was that they could use a Judas coin to add additional die damage to a roll they were making. So, and that the die that they used, it would increase the deeper they went into hell. Well, the thing about the Judas coins were they had a 50-50 chance of hitting the enemy they wanted them to hit, or they could have hit one of their allies or themselves. They are the coins of the ultimate betrayer, after all, so it kind of made sense. And so I'd roll a percentile die to see if it was going to hit an enemy or an ally. And then I'd roll a d6 because I had 6 players to see which one of the people that it was going to hit if it ended up hitting one of them. And sometimes they'd hit themselves. And it just kind of ended up being this kind of fun, chaotic thing. For some reason, I don't know why, but it was, they seem to really like to hit one particular player character. Like the majority of the time when they didn't hit the enemy, they would hit him. And it just ended up becoming a running joke. So they were a lot of fun. I also added more demons from the Lesser Key of Solomon. The books, I can't remember if it's the Dante's Guide to Hell or Virgilio's Untold Tales, but one of them mentions some other demons that are in the city of Dis, and they're from the Lesser Key of Solomon, like Balafor, Astaroth, Vasago, things like that. So I found that it was fun to actually add some additional ones in different areas of hell. So we had one, it was named Andros, and he was like one of the biggest, baddest of the bunch. And he kind of started attacking them at the beginning of the hell and just kind of was weaved through all the way up to Dis. And he was tied to one of my players' Infernal Chronicles. So by the time they finally were able to take him down in Dis, it was like a real triumph for them, which they really enjoyed. There are also a few of these demons who are essentially considered more good than evil. They tend to be more kind and more helpful and things like that because they want to be forgiven and eventually get back to heaven. So I used them. Some of them were tied to the rebellion, some of them helped the player characters. It was just kind of a way to add in a little more NPC interaction and role play opportunities and things. I did have a really cool video that goes through the lesser key. I will link it in the description. There's like 72, I think, demons in this lesser key, so video is definitely the most concise way to learn about them. I also added some more famous people who were punished in the Greek underworld. If you've read Dante's Inferno, you will know that Dante uses a lot of Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and stuff tied in. Like Medusa is in the original Dante's Inferno. So I added some more, like Ixion, Marsyas, Actaeon, the Danaides, and it kind of added some more role play opportunities. And then I also made some unique enemies based on some famous Greek underworld people, like Erysichthon. Erysichthon was the one who basically cut down Demeter's holy tree, and she punished him by essentially making him eat himself to death. So I made it so that when they were facing his demon form in hell, he could heal himself by biting off pieces of his own flesh. The characters enjoyed fighting him and the different dynamics of him. I also created some puzzle trap dungeons that were just solely puzzles and traps, no combat, because as I said, there's a lot of combat in this campaign. So I had like a gauntlet that Plutus had them go through to get some really powerful magic item. I had another like tower where they got the Spear of Longinus. So it's just some different things that you might want to add to kind of flesh out the world a little bit. But that is my review of the Dante's Guide to Hell module. Out of 5 stars, I would probably give it a 2.5, maybe a 3 in some aspects, so kind of right in there. Like I said, it's a really interesting setting and concept, but it's just not one that you want to run unless you are really ready and prepared to do a lot of home brewing. I hope that this was helpful. If you have any questions about the campaign or anything, feel free to ask me in the comments. Or if you'd like me to do more videos about things I added or things I changed or issues in the campaign, please let me know in the comments and I'll be glad to do that. If you found this helpful, I would really appreciate a like or a comment, or if you could subscribe to the channel, that would be awesome. It really helps me out a lot. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a lot of fun in your next D&D game.